Hey guys, welcome to another Theology Thursday, and this week we have another interesting question. It is, why did God command the Israelites to commit genocide as they took over the Promised Land? And that's a great question. It's one of those questions that I get asked often, but not very often in public. A lot of times people are afraid to ask these kinds of questions because they feel like they are questioning God. After all, God told the people, explaining to Moses how he was going to act before Moses led the people to the Promised Land and conquered some of the territory. But then Joshua really led the main campaign because Moses was not allowed to actually enter into the Promised Land. But under this whole process of leaving Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, and going into the Promised Land of the land of Canaan, also known as the Levant, or Palestine today, in this area of the world, the Middle East, that God tells them to kill everybody, men, women, and children. Or does he? You see, one of the things that we have to do as we read the Bible to answer these kinds of questions is we have to do more than just read an individual passage. Many ideas and concepts in the Bible are built over time, or because they are understood by the author and their audience, they aren't taught explicitly. They're more implied, they're implicit in their understanding and their teaching. And one of the things that, if we look at these specific nations that God commands Israel to conquer, some of them he tells them to destroy completely, men, women, and children. He does tell them that. But the others, he says, just drive them out of the land. What's the difference? Well, if you go through and look at the different tribes and people, the only ones that God tells Israel to destroy completely are the giant tribes. If you look at them, there are 5 different tribes of giants, and they're kind of lumped together, sometimes called the Raphaim or the Nephilim. And this gets us into a sticky point where people disagree. Some theologians believe that in the early account in Genesis, where it says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, thought they were beautiful, and took them as their wives, that they are talking about human beings, the tribes of the descendants of Adam's third son Seth, or the tribes of Cain that are coming together. And that is one interpretation. But the interpretation that the early Jewish leaders, the rabbinical teachers and writers, especially as they developed their theology during the development of Israel as a nation, and then of course under the time of captivity in Babylon and Persia, that they taught more clearly that these sons of God were heavenly beings. And that when heavenly beings left their place in heaven, and so many scholars think that this is what Peter and Jude are talking about when they talk about the heavenly beings who left their place and came down to earth. They're talking about the Nephilim. The Bible does tell us that the Nephilim are giants, heroes of old. And the interpretation of this by the ancient rabbis, by many of them, not all, but many, is that these were demigods. They were part heavenly being, part human being. And because of this, when they died, and this is, like I said, this is not in the Bible, this is extra biblical literature that we consult as we study the Bible, because while it's not sacred scripture, looking at the extra biblical text can give us information. So I'll give you an example. In the Bible, we find out that Pontius Pilate feels pressured by the Jewish religious leaders and gives in to them to crucify Jesus. Pilate did not want to have Jesus crucified. He found Jesus innocent, but he had him crucified anyway. Why did he do that? Well, if we look at the extra biblical information of writers and historians of the time, we find out that Pilate had a supervisor above him who was friendly and protected him, and that supervisor got promoted, and there was no longer a middleman to protect Pilate from the emperor who didn't like Pilate. That's why Pilate got stuck as a governor in a pagan nation to them. They did not follow the same gods of the Jews, and so this was a pretty cruddy assignment to get. And so we know from the extra biblical text that Pilate was scared of the emperor, and if there was a revolt, if there was a rebellion, Pilate would be at worst executed, but at best fired and maybe even thrown into prison. So that extra biblical information gives us insight, even though it's not the Bible. And the extra biblical insight we get from the rabbinical writings of these, intertestamental periods and the captivity periods are the belief that these demigods, these giants, their spirits had nowhere to go and they tormented people. And on top of that, that the giants were wicked pagans who taught the people how to worship foreign gods, false gods, and taught them how to, do all these abominable practices God did not want Israel to commit. And so God tells Joshua, and he starts before Moses, through Moses, and eventually to Joshua, to kill all the giant tribes. This is terrible to commit genocide. It's sad. But are there things in life, because of this fallen world we live in, that are terrible and sad that have to be done for things to be good and healthy? Are there just wars that need to be fought? Think about it in the medical situation. We're talking about a person maybe that has a gangrenous infection and then have to choose between amputating their arm or their leg and living. If they let the gangrene spread, they'll die. If they amputate the limb, they live. Well, no surgeon, no doctor wants to cut off somebody's arm and amputate it. That's terrible and sad. But it actually is what is needed for the rest of the person, their body, to be healthy and live. And this is what God wanted for the sake of Messiah. To preserve the pathway for Messiah, the promised land had to be protected and purged of the giant tribes. So, why did God command the Israelites to commit genocide? To eliminate the giant tribes, to get rid of all of that evil, so that the pathway for Messiah can be preserved. And that's one interpretation. There are others, but that's the one that I hold to. And if you have questions, or maybe this inspires you to have more questions, feel free to respond here in this chat, or to send me a direct message, and I'd be glad to continue talking about this further, or maybe even include your question in one of our next Theology Thursdays. So until then, be blessed.